In many ways, it's like a very simple strategy. Manufacture a problem, and then you solve the problem. And then on the other side of the problem, there's a new normal. What I think Trump is very good at is manufacturing chaos and then resolving chaos. And then on the other end, putting himself as the person who resolved the chaos that he caused.
It's pure strategy, wanting a lot more than you know you're going to get, and then meeting somewhere in the middle. And we're seeing this play out in real time.
It's like an apple with like a worm in it, right? And you got to remove the worm. So we dove into USAID. We just kept finding that it was not an apple with a worm in it. It was just a ball of worms. And that's why we have to get rid of the entire thing.
It's this economic hitman model where USAID is around providing aid to the world and saving babies and women and all that. That might be what it originally was doing, but it's morphed into this like mob. Like, I'm going to pay you to give me that. And like, if you don't do this, we're going to send in special ops and assassinate people.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Adventure Capitalist Podcast. My name's Austin Bronner, and I'm here with my co-host, Cody Shirk. Cody, how you doing?
I'm good. We just recorded another podcast that's going to come out after this one. So we were talking a lot. I'm pumped up. I'm ready to attack this episode.
Ready to attack. That's good. I like that attack mode for the episode. Yeah, we're excited. We got an episode. We're adding some more interviews. So there'll be more interviews coming out with people that we find fascinating that are either investors, entrepreneurs, adventurers. It's something coming your way on the podcast, and it's been a lot of fun. But speaking of adventure, you're about to hop on a flight this weekend, head down to Colombia, and do some climbing on a mountain covered in ice, which I didn't even know there was a mountain covered in Colombia with ice. Tell us about it.
I knew there was, but I've spent a lot of time in Colombia. I've been to pretty much every major city and, explore. I even own real estate down there. But there's an area of Colombia that I've never been to, and it's where these really high mountains are. And if you're a mountain climber or skier or understand elevations, this mountain's at 18,000 feet. So this is no tiny mountain. Like that's like, I get altitude sickness, so I know I'm going to have like 2 or 3 days of just splitting migraine headache. But yeah, we're flying to the city of Armenia, which is in the coffee district of Colombia. And then we're driving to this mountain. We have a full guide. You have to have a permit to climb this mountain. We got the crampons and ice picks and all that. I think it's a 4-day climb, and I'm pumped. I've done Kilimanjaro before. I've done Whitney, and I've done a couple others, but this is supposedly 2 or 3 days like in snow ice. So I'm probably gonna get my ass kicked because I am not good in high altitude and I don't like the cold. So I'm gonna be a grouchy little old lady on that mountain.
Well, I mean, you're more of a waterman, water creature. But they do call you Columbia Cody. Many people call you Columbia Cody.
Yeah,
so
that's
that
my
could
street
help
name.
you. Yeah.
The CC, the Columbia Cody, like the
Columbia
Compton
Cody.
Crips, or the Culver City Crips.
Why? So this specific mountain, what inspired you to go down here and climb it?
So one of my best buddies lives in Cali, Colombia, and I have another buddy, and we're like, hey, we need like a boys trip where we get away from our phones, we get away from everything, and we wanted something that didn't cost an arm and a leg too, because I think there's some value to that with your life, doing things that don't cost a lot of money, just things that are cheap and bring you back to nature and to humility. And so my buddy, his name's Patrick, in Colombia, he was like, hey, I got this great idea. We can just hire this guide that will take us up this mountain. And we're like, cool, let's do it. And 7 months ago, that was, you're like, oh, let's do it. And then when it comes time to actually do it, you're like, oh shit, what did I sign myself up for? So we will find out. We will find out very soon.
Well, I'm excited for the report. We got an excellent episode today. We got there's a lot of stuff going on. These are some of our kind of like briefing episodes where we dive in and talk about some of the stuff going on in the world, what it means for you. Let's kick off with the biggest news, the thing that has hijacked the brains of many people, tariffs. There's tariff talk all over right now. We've got tariffs Trump's got put tariffs on Colombia, on Panama, Mexico, Canada. There's Trump in China. And we've talked about tariffs previously on the podcast. And now they're starting and they're stopping and all things in between. So let's just dive into a little bit. Like, first of all, what happened this last week? What tariffs were proposed and what tariffs were rolled back? Give us kind of a briefing here.
Okay, so tariffs, as everybody knows, is a fee to bring products, services into the U.S. Or any country can implement a tariff. But that's what the U.S. has threatened to implement on other countries. So the most notable ones, like you just mentioned, are Canada and Mexico. They're our neighbors. Why would we impose tariffs on these two countries? And that's what everyone's freaking out about. Now,
I mean, they're yanking alcohol out of the liquor stores in Vancouver from red states. There's lots of the mayor of Toronto just canceled the contract with Starlink, ripped it up. So lots of outrage here.
But I want to defend myself a little bit here because a couple episodes ago we did the prediction of what's going to happen with Trump, and I predicted that tariffs would work. And we had a little short clip on YouTube, and the comment section was a hot mess, just attacking this guy's an idiot. I'm stupider for ever listening to this, and I feel a little bit vindicated now with the tariffs. So if you had listened to the full episode, what I basically said was tariffs will work because one, the purpose of a tariff is to augment the way that the country or a government actually receives funding. So if you lower the taxes of the individuals while increasing tariffs, the government's getting a net neutral amount of income coming in. The only difference is that the citizens aren't paying the tax. Now, that hasn't happened yet. So to be fair, that hasn't happened yet. But a lot of people are attacking like, oh, tariffs are just going to cause inflation and do all this stuff. To be fair, tariffs can be a little inflationary. But the other part about all this is what I tried to drive home. This is months ago. It's pure strategy. This is how you come to a table and you come to a negotiation with wanting a lot more than you know you're going to get, and then meeting somewhere in the middle. And we're seeing this play out in real time. So today, a couple of days ago, we saw that the tariffs for both Mexico and Canada have been pushed back 30 days because Trump got what he wanted. When it comes to Mexico, they put more troops along the border and they're going to supposedly stop the fentanyl thing. Now, to be fair here, a lot of people are saying, well, that already happened under Biden. Mexico already agreed to do that. The part that people don't understand in this 3D game of chess is that there's other things going on that nobody knows about. And I am going to make another bet here, another prediction that part of the tariff, let's say 30-day hiatus that the U.S. has accepted for Mexico, saying, hey, we won't impose tariffs for 30 days. Part of that is that the U.S. gets to send special forces into Mexico to take out the cartel. And we'll see if that happens. I don't even know if it's going to be public much, but I think that was part of this whole tariff deal. And then with Canada, some other stuff has happened there. We can dive into that in a moment. But the point is that Trump is using these tariffs as leverage to get what he wants, and he's more or less gotten what he's wanted so far.
Yeah, or at least that's the perception, right? And I think perception is perception is reality, and the perception. And I think what can be off-putting about this, and what people get frustrated with, is it looks, in many ways, it's like a very simple strategy. You create and manufacture a problem, and then you solve the problem. And then on the other side of the problem, there's a new normal, right? And what I think Trump is very good at is manufacturing chaos and then resolving chaos. And then on the other end, putting himself as the person who resolved the chaos that he caused. And so it's a consistent strategy. And but yeah, so far, let's talk about kind of each individual ones. So before Mexico and Canada, there was Colombia and Panama. Those were the first two. There was chaos created by, hey, we're going to put tariffs, and then tariffs removed with an outcome. So what happened in Colombia?
Well, Colombia was spurred on us returning illegal immigrants that had come from Colombia to the U.S. back to Colombia. And the Colombian president, Petro, said, no, you can't land your planes here. So the U.S. turned around the planes, came back to the U.S., and then said, fine, we're going to implement tariffs on you. And then Petro was like, all right, fine, sorry. We'll actually send our own Colombian plane to pick up our immigrants, and we will accept any other immigrants coming in. So that was, looking at that surface level, you go, oh my gosh, is the Colombian president that weak and that like unsophisticated? And you got to think like, whoa, maybe there's something more to it. Spoiler alert.
There's not.
That's who you're dealing with in the world political realm right now, is these people that have zero real world business negotiating experience, and they're now presidents of countries, and they're getting smacked around by Trump right now because Trump just spent the last 50 years doing real estate deals. Whether you like the guy or not, he literally wrote a book, Art of the Deal. Go read the book. Go listen to what he's been saying years before he was president. This is his strategy. He is doing exactly what he's done for 50 years in real estate, but he's doing it with other politicians, and he's smacking these politicians around. And Petro in Colombia is a perfect example of that. Now, the same thing happened with Scheinbaum in Mexico, the president of Mexico. The same thing happened with Trudeau. Pretty much every single politician who is opposed to Trump right now has very, very little real world experience. They are more or less like glorified community service leaders. Now, compare that to Putin or Xi Jinping. They don't necessarily have private, company experience, but those are real politicians. Those guys are legit negotiators. Not saying they're good. They know how to negotiate and play 3D chess like Trump does.
And to your point about the book, if you go and read Art of the Deal, he talks about this same sort of a thing in a boardroom where he comes in and he was like, I like to throw like a fit, basically, initially. I get upset, I freak out, and then I'll even walk out. And then I come back to the table, and that's when negotiations start, because it throws everybody off. And this is exactly what you're saying. In my opinion, it's like a manufactured fit that is throwing people off, and now they're getting to the table and starting to negotiate. So, like you said, Mexico, from all we know, they've agreed to send, I think, 100,000 of the National Guard to the border.
10,000, I think.
Was it 10,000?
10,000, yeah.
Okay, 10,000, and then to stem the flow of fentanyl. And then, interestingly enough, the U.S. said that we would do a better job of keeping weapons from getting to Mexico.
By the way, fair. That's a fair trade. We should not be allowing high-end military-grade weapons going into Mexico. Of course, who's getting that? The cartel, very clear there. So there should be some give and take on both sides. I strongly believe that there are some really key negotiating terms that were not disclosed to the public. And I have a very strong suspicion that part of the deal was for the U.S. to get access to send special force units to go into Mexico and take out elements of the cartel.
And part of it was, I think also in Canada, they had to recognize that the cartel was a terrorist organization. Mm-hmm. So, now you put them in a different category. It's more anti-terrorism than, anti-drug trafficking. So Panama is interesting because Panama was another one where he threatened tariffs, and then the tariffs got removed, and then they released. I know you follow the State Department releases very closely. So what's being signaled right now in Panama after this whole blow up with tariffs and then the resolution?
So specifically with Panama, this has to do with China, and we've actually talked about this on previous episodes, which China has this non-war war strategy where they do things that aren't really like super aggressive, or you can't really point your finger at them doing something wrong. But it's very clear that they have some strategy. This is exactly what they're doing with the Parcel Islands in the South China Sea. This is exactly what they're doing with the Coast Guard in the Philippines, how they're like harassing the Coast Guard. This is exactly what they're doing with Taiwan. This is exactly what they're doing all over Africa. And this is exactly what they're doing in Panama. So China is controlling both ends of the Panama Canal, effectively controlling it. Now, it's definitely a gray area because it's not like they took over Panama and controlling Panama. It's just kind of like, what's going on here? And in the 1977 treaty, when the U.S. returned the Panama Canal back to Panama, in that treaty, it says that if Panama gets overthrown by some foreign nation, the U.S. has the right to come in and militarily take back the canal. So what's going on right now is this situation where Trump is going, China is effectively controlling this canal by the power that they've taken over on either end of the canal. And if you don't, he's talking to Panama, if you don't kick these guys out and return it back to U.S. favored control, we're going to come in there militarily. Now, I don't think he'll come in there militarily. It's just like one of those negotiating tactics we were talking about earlier. But I do think it's a real threat because it does pose a real threat if China is able to control the canal, because that's a lifeline for the U.S. as far as transportation of goods go. So Panama agreed to end the agreement with China that they had. China has, again, control on either end of the canal there. It expires in 2027, and they've agreed to relinquish or to get out of that agreement. It's worth noting, though, that China has invested in Panama heavily in other projects. And I saw that there when I used to invest in real estate in Panama. They put in this like subway system. It's kind of this above ground subway thing on this like rail. And honestly, it took forever. It was one of those like Chinese projects that just like, come on, like finish this thing, get this thing done. But you could definitely see that influence of China in Panama for other projects. And it's clear because China wanted to have control over that canal because it's extremely important for their economy for shipping goods from the Pacific all the way into the Atlantic.
So what is your take here on, let's just give some context as well. This comes out, the rollout tariffs, 25% on Mexico, Canada. This happens on a Sunday. Crypto market absolutely just dumps overnight.
Scary.
It was like, yeah, like 20. Bitcoin held up pretty well, but everything else was dumped like at least 20. Many of these coins dumped like 20, 25%. And then it basically comes all right back once these things get resolved. Not all the way, but close. Where do you think it goes from here, right? So this is definitely it doesn't seem like this is the end of the tariff negotiating, tariff rollout. What's your prediction next 6 months for how this impacts the markets, how this impacts like the average investor?
So specific for crypto, I think the crash that we saw had more to do with a liquidity issue, meaning people weren't necessarily selling crypto because they were panicked of a market crash. They were selling crypto to go back into a stable coin because they needed liquidity for X, Y, Z. Effectively, that is panic by selling crypto. But the point is, it was more of a liquidity issue because the fear is if cross-border commerce or trade is frozen up, you need liquidity to survive in whatever, wherever you're domiciled. Now, the longer term prediction here, I think that most market participants and even the general public has kind of had this aha moment, like we just talked about, which is, oh, Trump threatened these things, but he's not actually going to go through with it because the counterparty that he's negotiating with is going to make a deal. And so these tariffs are actually never really going to come into effect. So with countries like Mexico, Canada, almost all of Latin America and Europe, I think it's going to be kind of a rocky road, but more or less get figured out with no real impacts to the end consumer. But China and the US, that's a real trade war that I think is going to get worse. I think there's going to be tariffs thrown back and forth, and also the just complete ending of certain trades. So for example, China just announced that they're going to stop exporting more rare earth minerals. And that's something that China completely has a monopoly around globally. That has been the concern for a long time. Last year, they stopped the export of some rare earth minerals, and they're doing even more now. Side note, that's why a big part why Trump wants access to Greenland as well. Greenland has rare earth minerals there, in addition to the Arctic transportation corridor for the U.S. to control. That's his interest in Greenland. And what's unfolding right now with trade with China and the U.S., I do think that will get worse, and I do think that will have longer-term serious effects for global markets.
I think the biggest consequence of this ambiguity is for the business, like the average business owner who is, I've been in the e-commerce space for a long time. I work with a lot of clients who have companies based in the U.S. They import goods from all over, and it just gets all of them are like, what do we do here? Like, this is going to get complicated really quickly. And they don't know, there's not, just like there was, we talked about this in some previous episodes, that there was a lot of ambiguity from the Biden administration about certain things. This is where there's ambiguity from the Trump administration. As these things whipsaw back and forth, yes, there's this, in my belief, that we're a pro-business administration, yet businesses do not thrive when there's ambiguity around tariffs, ambiguity around how much it's going to cost. Are they going to have to pay more taxes? How do you even place purchase orders if you don't know if they're going to be 25% more when they get to the border? That's a challenge that right now I think is maybe underappreciated.
For sure, but I also think that this is a little bit of a reversion to the mean in the general world order, meaning for the past several decades, there's been a lot of certainty that the US dollar is going to reign supreme, that the US-led order is going to maintain its, calm collective operating status, and that you're going to be able to import forks from China into the US or whatever product. This is just like a very, certain feeling that people have about the market. The problem is that things have slowly deteriorated to a point where the US really is in a weaker position on a number of things. It stems from, or it ranges from USAID, which we've talked about, wasting ridiculous amounts of money around the world, all the way to these trade imbalances with really our friends, Mexico and Canada. We have a trade imbalance there in terms of what's fair and what's not fair. It's like, you can look at the numbers. It's pretty clear to say that this is not fair. And if we continued this path, the US is just going to deteriorate more and more. So what I believe Trump is doing is trying to correct this. The problem is it's going to create some short-term ambiguity. That's a hard word. Ambiguity. It's going to create this short-term uncertainty as things get figured out, and it is going to be painful for investors. The flip side of that is someone who likes volatility. This is a great time to make some money because there are some huge gaps in the market as it pertains to value right now, meaning there's some things that are ridiculously overvalued. And then there's some things around the world that are just being forgotten about that are insanely cheap right now. So for an investor looking for opportunity, this is like, you're craving this, because a market that's just like straight and no volatility.
For traders, you're saying traders. Yeah.
But even for investors, because for an investor, for traders for sure, because you can trade that volatility. But for investors, you're always looking for like really inexpensive things. And in a perfectly efficient market, it's sometimes hard to find undervalued opportunities.
I mean, if you were awake and had some orders set up, you could have scooped up some really good cheap crypto. Sui was down from like
scary
down to 2.7.
I don't want to like share what my it was bad. The numbers I saw flex like over the past 3 days were sickening.
Yeah. So you mentioned USAID. Did you happen to see some clips from Elon's Spaces talk about what USAID?
I saw a little bit. I don't know what you're referring to exactly, but I did see several politicians reach out and go, this isn't right. We need USAID. And then you look at those politicians' association of groups that get direct funding from USAID, and you're like, come on, dude, you get millions of dollars from this group. Of course you don't want it to disappear. For sure.
I thought that the part was interesting is he was like, he was talking about how they were diving into each individual organization. And he was like, many of them have, it's like an apple with like a worm in it, right? And you got to remove the worm. He was like, as we dove into USAID, we just kept finding that it was not an apple with a worm in it. It was just a ball of worms. And that's why we have to get rid of the entire thing, which I thought was interesting, considering last week's episode talking about, what's actually going on.
Exactly. Yeah. We told exactly what's going on, which is it's this economic hitman model where USAID is around providing aid to the world and saving babies and women and all that. That might be what it originally was doing, but it's morphed into this like mob. Like, I'm going to pay you to give me that. And like, if you don't do this, we're going to send in special ops and assassinate people. Serious. That's like what it turned into. It's bad.
Well, speaking of mobs and mafia type behavior, I'm going to move on to China a little bit, talking about what is going on in China. China has been under construction, and they are continuing to be under construction. They are in build mode. So Interesting thing that came out, China's building a massive military city command center that's 10 times bigger than the Pentagon. It's about 20 miles southwest of Beijing. And on a previous episode, we talked about some of the construction going on south of Beijing. And some of the satellite imagery from the U.S. officials suggests the facility, which is referred to informally as Beijing Military City, spans 1,500 acres. So massive. And just to put in some context, if you spent any time in China, especially in the larger cities, I went to Shenzhen about 8 years ago for their largest trade conference, the Canton Fair. And I started walking around. Have you been to the Canton Fair?
I have.
Yeah. When you go to the Canton Fair, if you've never been there, and you start walking around this trade show, you quickly put it in scale to like the largest city in the US, and you realize you're like, wow, this building is no joke, 10 times larger than like a football stadium in the US, which are typically the largest buildings in a city, these football stadiums. And I remember walking around. It's just the scale of what's going on in China is so crazy. It's hard to put it in context. So think about the Pentagon, large building. This is going to be 10 times bigger. It's the same sort of thing going on at a military level that has been going on the commercial level when they build trade fairs or convention centers. They're 10 times bigger than the largest convention center in the U.S. So I'm interested, Cody, in your take on this. Why should people care about this? What's interesting to you about this new military city that is being built?
So there's a quote, and I'm going to butcher the quote, but it basically says something like democracy gets in the way of progress. And when you look at China, whatever you want to call it, some people say it's more capitalist than the US, which I think may be accurate, but it's certainly run by a centralized group of people. Of course, Xi Jinping at the top. And they get things done. When they say we're going to do something, they can have these mega projects that get done. And this is something that the Chinese civilization has done over millennia. I mean, look at the Great Wall of China or any of the, historical artifacts in that country. It's like, how did they do this? And I think this is one of those examples in modern times. The Pentagon is huge, and this thing's 10 times bigger than the Pentagon. Like, I can't wrap my head around that. 1,500 acres, if anybody's out there who's ever walked like a ranch, you walk like a 500-acre ranch, walk the perimeter, like that takes you a while. That takes you a long time. 1,500 acres. This thing is like it's hard to imagine. So
they have 100 cranes operating at the site.
The skyscraper cranes, like the big tower cranes, not the on the back of a truck crane. 100 of those cranes. And the other thing that I thought was interesting from the analyst said, the expansion aligns with broader goals set by Chinese President Jinping, who has called for a fully modernized military by 2027, the centenary of the PLA. That's Xi.
So that timeline. Is that the 100 centenary? Does that mean the 100th anniversary?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. 2027, it's 100th anniversary. That timeline has fueled concerns among Western analysts about potential Chinese military actions, particularly regarding Taiwan. So there's a bunch of U.S. military generals who have argued that if China would make a move on Taiwan, it would not be any time before 2027. So the fact that they're predicting this building is going to be done by 2027, of course, conveniently aligns with the date. I don't necessarily think it correlates with Taiwan. I just think it shows that China's taking a more serious approach to developing their military. And the other thing I think is interesting is that this is one location, right? This is one huge facility. So they're clearly developing a lot of high tech, whether it's espionage, AI, whatever it is, it's in one area. So they're clearly prioritizing some military strategy for the future that has to do with developing intel and operations in this one center. Long story short, China ain't fucking around. They're building stuff and they're getting serious.
They're also building a huge fusion research facility. I'm going to read you a little bit of the story here because it's quite interesting. The headline I love the headline. China's artificial sun fuels Western fears. It has lost race to the energy holy grail. So, Western governments, investors have spent much of last week fretting about scientific breakthroughs from China. Again, part of this is because of DeepSeek, which we haven't talked about on the show, but DeepSeek is talked about everywhere. We didn't bring it up, but they came out of nowhere and made OpenAI look a little bit silly. And so this fusion center, right? Very interesting. They appear to be building a large laser ignited fusion research center in the southwestern city of Mianyang. And this is a development that could aid nuclear weapons design and work exploring power generation. So I guess it's similar to the layout of the $3.5 billion U.S. National Ignition Facility in Northern California, which generated more energy from a fusion reaction than lasers pumped into the target scientific break-even, which I don't totally know what that means. Do you?
A little bit. I know enough to get myself in trouble. So basically,
okay, let's get in trouble here.
Let's get in trouble. There's a laser that there's two lasers, and there's this huge facility that the U.S. Developed in California. And when you target this laser specifically at a certain angle, direction, blah, 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 you create this fusion reaction. And the breakthrough was that the power needed to power this laser was less than the actual fusion reaction. And what this results in is you able to put energy into one source and then direct it to another in this fusion reaction and create even more energy. I mean, eventually that's perpetual motion, which is not real, or at least has never been found out before. So this breakthrough that California had, and this is pretty big in the news, this is several years ago, this big discovery. China has built a facility that's 50% larger than the one in the U.S. Now,
whether it's 50% better, we don't know.
For sure. We don't know what's going on in the interior. And there's some skeptics that say that, hey, you don't even need a really big facility. In fact, there's an argument why there should be smaller facilities distributed across the country to create power. The end goal here, to be clear, this is for power generation. So the concern with what outsiders have is, wow, China is not only matching our technology in the U.S., they may be surpassing it. And if you look at energy as the lifeblood to a civilization and an economy, perhaps they have found this way to have energy that's much more efficient than us. And the news picked up on it, and a lot of people are like, oh, they have more nuclear power and they're going to use nuclear power to destroy us and all that. And that's not what this is going on here. This has to do with power generation and the ability to produce energy, electricity effectively in a very efficient and controlled way that is far superior than anything else we have, like especially compared to coal power plants, what the Chinese have been building like crazy.
It's super interesting, and energy is going to continue to be a big topic as data centers are sucking up more and more. Like, we're just using more energy per person, and that doesn't seem like it's stopping at any time soon. So definitely interesting stuff going on in China, continuing to build. Let's move on a little bit and talk about this U.S. State Department and a change in trajectory, right? Because on this show, we talked a lot about the previous administration and what they were doing down in Latin America. A lot of the rare earth minerals, they were going down and meeting and resetting relations. And now you have a new administration, and you've got new ideas, and you've got a new Secretary of State going down and meeting with heads of state. So there was a message released, said, bringing U.S. foreign policy home, advancing American interests first. Rubio went down to Panama, El Salvador, Costa Rica, Guatemala, and the DR to focus on mutual priorities that will both, quote, government speak, mutual priorities that will bolster stability, security, and prosperity at home and in the region. And some interesting kind of quotes from here. It's, the president wants a prosperous Western Hemisphere full of opportunities. We want to strengthen trade ties, create partnerships to control migration, and enhance our hemisphere security. And yeah, some of these places he named specifically, I thought was interesting. Illegitimate regimes in Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela are intentionally amplifying the chaos. All the while, the Chinese Communist Party uses diplomatic and economic leverage, such as the Panama Canal, to oppose the United States. And we want to resist the influence of countries such as China who promise more than they deliver down in Latin America and Central America. Big change, trajectory-wise and language-wise. Where do you think this goes? And
I think this is really bullish.
Yeah,
I'm not going to say I'm surprised, but maybe a little bit surprised actually. But now that I read through everything, there's multiple releases on this on the State Department's website. If you want to dive into this yourself, any listener who doubts what's going on here. And what I read through and what it is saying is that, as you mentioned earlier, El Salvador, Guatemala, Costa Rica, Panama, and the DR are countries that the U.S. State Department is specifically wants to realign and strengthen ties with. And part of the reason why they want to do this is because, well, it's multifaceted. Number one is we need to get countries near us to ramp up their manufacturing capability and basically ability to have a successful economy to support the U.S. economy. It's much more effective to have countries close to us be our partners than countries around the world. Like logistically, that just makes sense, right? But also, it's easier for us to maintain those relationships because it's English to Spanish language, a much more similar culture than some of these Asian nations. Nothing against the Asian nations. It just makes more sense for us to be doing trade more locally. But most importantly, if we're helping these economies develop in Central America, that's where a lot of these immigrants are coming from because their economies in Central America are failing. Because the U.S. is not doing much trade with them. So the thought is if we are investing and help develop these economies in Central America, those people are going to have more incentive to stay where they are because they're going to have a happier, more freedom-filled and successful life with a ladder with rungs closer together to climb. And the U.S. wants to support that. I think it's notable, like you said, we are not supporting Nicaragua, Venezuela, or Cuba because, of course, they're part of the axis of evils. So I think for investors, anybody listening to this, like, what does this mean? How do I make money? I think this is a pretty big tell from the U.S. government of saying we are going to prioritize not only businesses coming from those countries, like the actual trade, but we'll probably invest money into these countries as well to help them develop their economies. So if you're, in the U.S. or abroad and looking for a country that may be injected with a lot of capital and opportunities soon, I think those are some places you should be looking.
Next week we dive in on the episode a lot into Nicaragua and what's going on down there, and it's pretty interesting and compelling. You'll have to listen to next week's episode about Nicaragua. The interview we did, the person we interviewed actually likes Nicaragua. I don't like Nicaragua. Great surf, fantastic surf. I spent a lot of time there. It's pretty messed up. And I don't know what he was looking at that I didn't see, but yeah,
there's a lot of things that are, could improve there.
Well, this is where my question around how this is going to go. Culturally, it's very different. Guatemala, El Salvador, Costa Rica versus some of the Asian countries that a lot of the manufacturing has come from. Yep. And I'm cautiously optimistic, but I have some big questions on, like, what does it look like to build stuff down there, and will it be as productive as they think it's going to be to move stuff back down into Central America? It hasn't ever been. I mean, there's obviously stuff that's been created and manufactured in Guatemala, but they've been generally low skilled stuff. And I'm interested to see how this actually plays out and whether or not they'll be able to make a lot of progress on moving supply chain stuff down there, because that's no easy feat, right? That's especially over a short this is where, like, the difference between China and the US is really stark. China can say within their own country, we're going to build this massive thing and we're going to do it on a 10 or 20 year timeline. We are exerting influence in at most 4 year windows, because things can swing back massively with a different administration. So we'll see how that goes.
Right. I think that the big picture here too, in addition to us wanting to develop countries that are near us or closer to us, is also preventing the influence of other countries like China and Panama, which we just discussed, which is China clearly influenced Panama significantly because the U.S.
and in Nicaragua.
We ignored our neighbors. We completely ignored them. And I don't think anybody would disagree with that. We have spent so much time fighting wars in the Middle East and doing business with Asian countries because labor has been so cheap there. And we've just completely ignored our neighbors down here. And frankly, that's come back to bite us in the ass. And if we don't change course soon, of course, China is going to make more of an influence. Like if I'm Guatemala or Costa Rica or any of these countries and the U.S. has just forgotten about us, and then China comes around along and is like, we'll lend you money, we'll build you ports, we'll build you infrastructure. Of course you're going to do business with them. And I think that's what Trump is seeing unfold in real time, and he's trying to reverse that right now. And it's not a Biden issue. I think that's just been happening for decades. This is just like the way that things have been going as of lately.
One thing that's interesting, we spent a good amount of time in Guyana the last year and have contacts down there who are building stuff connected to the US, but not fully aligned, right? But they go to the embassy there and they work with the Americans there. And they continually tell us how helpful the US embassy is. They're like the most helpful people in Guyana. They can go there and shit just gets done. They make connections. They connect people to American companies, and they get a lot more help. It's very funny. These are foreigners, so they are people that live part-time in Guyana but aren't Guyanese, and they get more help from the U.S. embassy and the commercial division than they do from the Guyanese government. So we're definitely good at moving and facilitating business, and I'm interested to see how this goes. And
we've talked about that before. That's like if you're a hungry investor that wants to go on an adventure in a different country, one of your first stops should be at the U.S. embassy. I wish I'd known this in my 20s when I was doing this. I never went to the U.S. embassy, but the U.S. embassy's job is literally to help U.S. citizens in that country. And if you go to them, obviously they could do passport issues, or if you get in trouble or there's some like crime that happens. But their other job is to actually facilitate commerce because they want their U.S. citizens to influence that country in a positive way. And in Guyana, as we saw, they were like, what do you need? We'll help you import airplanes for the U.S. to Guyana. We'll help you do whatever you need. And
we got contacts.
For sure. So if you're thinking, I should go to Guatemala or Costa Rica or El Salvador or Panama, I guarantee you the State Department is saying to those embassies right now, we need to help Americans as much as possible be successful in these countries because we want these countries to succeed and be favorable to America.
What's your favorite of those countries, right? Central America. What's your favorite for just like personal? What's the place you spent the most time in that you enjoy the most? That you feel
I spent a lot of time in a lot of those countries. I would say the most is Panama Panama. Yeah, I would say Panama is probably the best for like a first timer. Like you want to go out into the world and invest in a foreign nation. That's probably the best because first of all, they're on the US dollar standard. A lot of people speak English there. The property rights are pretty strong. It has the canal, so they're relatively geopolitically stable. Nobody wants to really screw that canal. They're in a location that's at a crossroads for a lot of places, literally between North America and South America. And then next up on the list in Central America, I'd say is Costa Rica. Costa Rica actually is a very well put together country relative to their neighbors. And that's really because they've done a good job of developing their tourism industry. They've done a really good job of protecting their environment and then figuring out ways to monetize that protection that they've provided to the nature there. And anybody who's been to Costa Rica knows it's just a beautiful country. And then down the list, I would put Guatemala, Honduras, etc. And then El Salvador, the last one. I spent a lot of time in El Salvador 20 years ago.
Mainly surfing?
Mainly surfing. Super dangerous, like very, very dangerous country. And I have a lot of stories about like some of the scariest times of my life in El Salvador. But now, 20 years later, it's what, the safest country in the Western Hemisphere, which is wild. Bukele has really turned that country around.
It's very, very interesting. Well, yeah, those are some of the big updates from the week. yeah, we're going to continue to keep experimenting on this show, bringing in new guests, new concepts, new styles of episodes. We love to hear from you. If you guys are listening and you've been, if you're a consistent listener and you've not yet gone and written us a review, one of the best things you can do is go head over to Apple Podcasts, write us a review, let us know how you feel about the show, what you like. That is the best way to support us. And yeah, thank you for listening. It's always fun. We'll talk to you in the next episode.